Hi, everyone. I have the privilege tonight to introduce our special guest, Alastair Murray from Canterbury branch in New Zealand. I've just jotted down a few notes here, so I'll just go to those. Alastair is the past president of the Canterbury branch. He has been a member. I just had a look, Alastair, been a member for 11 years. 2011 was when you joined. And Alastair was the founding president when the branch reopened to become the Canterbury branch. And I myself have known Alastair for many years. I know him to be kind, to be open, to be friendly, and just a great human being, and someone I've dealt with now for many, many years. So, I could just kick off from there, but I will say a few things about Alastair. Alastair has four children and his wife Laura down there in Canterbury. He is a medical specialist and he is a specialist consultant in surgical pathology. It's interesting that it's in the area a little bit. You are dealing with death in your job. Alastair has a diploma in Theosophy and also the higher diploma in Theosophy that the UK section run a course on, and he only completed those, I think, only last year or the year before. I did ask Alastair what sort of brought him to Theosophy, and his whole life was going through a recalibration, is how he put it. Some people might say crisis there, Alastair, but he was going through something, and so it made him turn his focus. And he had a choice of buying more scientific books or start to buy spiritual books. And he chose the spiritual books. And the first book he actually chose was Life Between Lives, which I understand we're touching on tonight as well. So let me welcome Alastair, and the talk tonight is the message of the near-death experience. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Renee, and thank you, John, for your assistance. And hi to everyone around New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Philippines, and India, and any other place in the world. Very nice to have you come and listen to a talk which was originally made just for our little local branch down here in Canterbury. So it's been promoted to the international stage. So that's very kind. I think the message hopefully will be seen as of universal importance, that of the near-death experience. And I've put my name down at the bottom of the title in small letters, and also YouTube, because I think one of the good things about the talk tonight hopefully will actually be not so much me talking, but the people who have actually experienced these very life-changing experiences of what happens around the time of death. And so there will be about 3 20-minute segments towards the end of the talk from various speakers. 2 of those have had near-death experiences, and the last person, Dr. Michael Newton, a hypnotherapist, will talk about a technique which he helped develop for experiencing that life in between lives phenomenon. So if we start with the next slide, perhaps, John. This is just a reminder. The world is in a difficult place right now. And I think even by tuning in tonight, you are doing a little bit of self-care, for your soul, because hopefully it will put things into perspective and remind everyone about what we are really doing here, what our role is as souls incarnating in the body, and put some of the other troubles in the world perhaps in perspective. So what is a near-death experience? Nowadays, it's a concept which is pretty much understood. It's had a pretty rapid rise in modern culture over the last 25, 30 years. And in fact, we can see a couple of the dictionary definitions. My grandfather had a near-death experience in 1975. He didn't know it at the time when he spoke to my father about it, but there was no words to say, oh yes, I had a near-death experience. He told my father that when he was in hospital for a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, he had this experience of floating above his body and going down a tunnel and going to a place with beautiful music and beautiful gardens. And that's how he described it to my father, and my father thought, oh, it might have been something to do with the medicines. And I only found out about this as a teenager after he'd passed permanently. So at that time, there was no real terminology for near-death experience. So what we understand is of near-death experience is that those sort of episodes around the time of death, which people can recall. However, the history may in fact go back quite a bit further. Human beings, while we might have the technology now to bring people back, while in the past may not have, there would have been times where people would have come back from whatever particular injury. And so one of the first, perhaps, examples of what may be considered a near-death experience is what they call the myth or account of in Plato's Republic, which was written 380 BC. And in this, there is a soldier by the name of from Pamphylia, who is a soldier in a battle and dies. And at the end of the battle, the locals are collecting all of the bodies up. And they notice that there is this one body which hasn't decomposed. 2 days later, they're putting all of the bodies on the funeral pyre and about to set them alight. And this man, whose body is not decomposed, gets up and tells everyone about this amazing experience of having traveled to a land of light and where there were higher souls or people he described as judges, which showed him the good things and bad things of his life and also the consequences of those good things and bad things. And he was able to visit some of the realms where he was able to experience beautiful landscapes, beautiful music, some of the things which are very similar in modern near-death experiences. So while not technically called a near-death experience, there are many features which are similar. So whether that was in fact a near-death experience, very interesting to speculate. And this is a picture by Hieronymus Bosch, and it was painted sometime between 1505 and 1515. He was a Dutch painter. This is one of 4, but you'll see that the soul's being led up by guardians perhaps, and through a tunnel, and with a bright being of light at the end of the tunnel. So again, this imagery is very much to the fore in many of the examples of near-death experience. Perhaps the modern history of documented near-death experiences begins with this man, Dr. Raymond Moody. In fact, he first started his training as a philosopher, and while he was in a lecture being given by a gentleman, a visiting physician by the name of Dr. George Ritchie, who himself in the 1940s as a medical student had died from what was double viral pneumonia, and mentioned his experience of visiting an interesting place and an experience of being a soul and going through walls and seeing things where people couldn't hear him or see him. And that really intrigued Dr. Moody, Raymond Moody at that time. And he later on finished his PhD in philosophy, then did a PhD in psychology, and then decided that wasn't enough and went back to medical school and trained as a psychiatrist. And so he was really the first person to write about near-death experiences formally, and it was his book, Life After Life, which became a national bestseller, which really put the first research into publication on this topic. So he came up with a list of 12 near-death experience elements. Various other people have come up with different varieties of experience. And Raymond Moody himself mentions that not everyone has all of these 12, but these are 12 relatively common features. In particular, people know that this is a real experience. This is not because of a secondary effect of hypoxia or a drug effect, for example. Often people will feel a sense of peace. Whatever experience they were going through, usually because, near-death experience, it can be quite traumatic, either trauma or myocardial infarction, for example. And people will often describe being above their bodies, perhaps being met by a guide, traveling down a tunnel, visiting or seeing a being of light. And one of the experiences which people will often talk about is what's called the life review. And for me, for example, the panoramic life review is what I find particularly interesting, because it's where people get to learn about what they did right and perhaps what they didn't do, which was, what they did do, which wasn't as good as perhaps they could have done. And one of the things the speakers will mention is how brutally honest it is, but always within an environment of complete love and acceptance. No real judgment at all by the other beings, spiritual beings who are there with you. But people, you can't hide behind what you've done and how you've affected other people. So anyway, we'll move on and start with one of our first videos. And this is a video from the early 1990s, given by Renee Passaral. She's a Baha'i, her faith, and she's giving this talk at a Baha'i convention in early 1993. She's, I think, early 40s at this stage, and she's going to recount an episode of when she was 16. She'd always had issues with health and her immune system. She'd developed multiple sclerosis as a young child, and she had various allergies. And at this particular time when she was 16, the time of her near-death experience, she just had an anaphylactic reaction to something she had eaten and had collapsed. And so this is where we pick up the story. It's about 20 minutes long. Her actual total talk's about an hour and a half. So we're just going to see a snippet, but hopefully you'll find that this is quite valuable. Thanks, John.
That I began to feel my consciousness pull up to a place around the heart, and the life pull out of the very extremities of my body. And there was a great sense of peacefulness, of luxuriant surrender and calm and beauty that we don't usually have access to in this realm of existence. Then in an instant, I found myself like that, outside of the body. And it was as if I had never been myself before. It was as if I had never been alive before. By contrast, I had never experienced consciousness before, because in an instant, I was suddenly conscious, suddenly massively conscious. And I was conscious just not of a self, but of all of those around me, of their inner thoughts, of their inner motivations, of their inner beings, of their inner realities, of all those that cared for me, of the firemen, the two firemen that were working on me, of my mother and the neighbor, of this great sense of catastrophe and grief and shock. It was as if I were all of the people, all at once, with a consciousness even beyond their own normal consciousness. And it was overwhelming. It was astounding. It was as if I were literally being pummeled by consciousness and by awareness. I followed the attention of those in the crowd around the body to something that was then on the sidewalk. And I began to examine it as if with their own eyes. And I looked, and I recognized the curve of this wrist here, which was about all that was visible, because I was being straddled at that point in time by the fireman who had then resorted to mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I heard them say that we've lost her. That I heard that one fireman talking to the other one saying, "We've lost the pulse." And I was fully aware of the elder fireman who had straddled me, that he couldn't allow this to happen. He felt that he couldn't turn and face my mother, because he too had a daughter that was about 2 years younger than I at that point in time. And he imagined turning to face his wife and telling her that their child had died, and he refused to give up the struggle. this sudden awareness of this cacophony of input, and my sudden repulsion at the very idea that I had considered my essence, my reality, my being to be this body was so horrific to me and so hurtful to me that, again, my consciousness bumped up like that above some wires. Again, this makes no sense in terms of the way that we move physically, because suddenly I realized I was without a body. And as I called to those beneath me, trying so hard to communicate to them that everything was as it should be, that I was fine, that I was free, that we were eternally and essentially and always connected, and we would never be separate because of our love for one another. As I tried to call out to them, and I realized they didn't hear me, and as I tried to warn them of a child coming out of a house down the street, actually, which was not something that was at all physically visible from my vantage point, who was going to see the body on the sidewalk and who was going to be shocked seeing this swollen and rather gray-looking, distorted body. And I was calling out to his mother to collect him. Then I realized that they couldn't hear me, that I couldn't touch them, that I had no mouth, I had no voice, I had no body, I had no place in this realm of existence anymore. And so, with that realization, I called upon God for assistance to guide me to my new home. My consciousness, which then could best be described as if it were a ball of light, and it was conscious and it could perceive like a sphere, like it had massive senses in a spherical sense, then began to rise. And as I rose, I saw beneath me the street and the town and the little valley and the little area in which we lived. And then I began to continually ascend until I could see the entire earth. And I could see not in the sense that one sees with physical eyes, where I am the perceiver and there's an object here that I perceive, but this seeing was really a sense of being, of experiencing, of knowing, of a total gestalt, you might say, of the entire earth. And I could see that the earth was essentially one, and that we as human beings have a unique creative and spiritual responsibility for the state of the earth, because really by the state of our hearts we can create around us in our environment effects. And I could see that nothing existed for an instant without purpose, nothing existed alone, no thought went unnoticed, the intention of no heart went without impact upon every molecule in existence, let alone you can imagine the impact of one heart upon another, even of people who had no connection or way of knowing one another. You could see that the earth was one, and that we, as the human body, were one. I could also perceive that all reality, all existence, was emanating from a source of light and life and love, and that all physical reality reflected this life and light and love to whatever extent it's possible. At this point, I became so enchanted that I was beyond being, I think, a self. I simply was, and it was as if I were singing my own note in this grand symphony of life and existence that's the earth and all of us. And I began to sing, I am. And it was not a statement of ego or self, it was really a statement of absolute love, that by my being I simply was expressing absolute love and connectedness and unity and harmony with all of existence. And I was adding my particular and absolutely unique note to this grand song of life that reverberated throughout all existence. I turned then to the source of light and life that I could feel penetrating this physical world. And I began to move towards it. And as I moved towards it, I entered what has been described as the tunnel. It was really a place of transition. It was a place that I perceived to be limited, a place of relative darkness, and it seemed to be a place of confusion for many souls who were wandering there. They were beyond my assistance, but I remember praying for them and remember knowing that I was powerless really to touch these beings. What moved me through this phase of the experience, through what's known as the tunnel, this constricted sort of a junction between the worlds, I discovered was not a decision on my part. It was not a motivation. There was no way to gain one's place of location. It was as if I were a diver at the bottom of the sea without being able to see the sun. What moved me through this place of transition was love. This was the force, the attractive force and the motivator that moved me through this phase of transition. And this was the love of all loves. So it wasn't mere human love, but it was really the love of God, the love of goodness, the love of beauty, the love of mercy, the love of compassion, the love of all of those abstract spiritual qualities. This moved me through that place of transition. And as I moved, the thought and the reality became one and the same as I wondered whether I would be alone. And at that instant, I merged with my uncle. And this was a glorious homecoming, because I had been very enchanted with my uncle. He had been about 6'5", very tall man, looked like a Mohawk. My uncle Gene, and he had passed away about a year and a half before, and I was very sad because he lived on the other side of the country in Tennessee and North Carolina, and we lived in California, and I never had a chance to really spend any time with him in this life, although I loved him dearly. And so this was a grand reunion, but it was beyond the reunion that we can have in this physical life. It wasn't as if we were hugging like this, because this is as close as two people can come physically, really, but it was as if we were two lights or two fragrances or two essences that completely merged, and his reality became my reality, and my reality became his reality, and everything that he was or knew or ever wanted or thought or felt, and everything likewise that I was or knew or felt or knew, or any spiritual essence that on my part, these two became literally as one. While this was incredibly joyous, still I felt beyond the calling of my ultimate home. I moved then again through the power of the force of attraction of love from this reunion with my uncle into what I can best describe as a sea of light. This sea of light, it was as if one had entered the solar wind, and it was as if every atom had become a sun in and of itself, and every one of these suns was singing and welcoming me as an individual into this realm of existence with a song of beauty and unconditional love. This love of which I speak can best be described as agape, not as human love, but rather this impersonal, global, pure, unconditional, selfless and stainless and creative force of love that I felt. And I felt these suns welcoming me into the sea of light. And again, I was being moved through the sea of light on waves of greater and greater and increasing love. Then again, in an instant like that, I entered the center of the sea of light, which was, to me, the essence of all essences, the source of all sources, the source of all life and all reality and existence. And with the entering into this sun, I can best describe it, it was as if I had become the quintessential phoenix. The entering into this sun really became the instant of dissolution of self, the dissolving of the personal and separate reality that we know to be ourselves. And this state of absolute nothingness as an individual, but this was a state of being in and of, and because of the light, was to me the apex of everything that I could have ever hoped for. It was really the desire of all desires, to be as nothing in this loving and powerful and incredibly beautiful light. It seemed that I existed in that state of nothingness, really, for a time beyond time. And yet, then again, I was gathered together as an individual. It was as if I had become sands upon a shore, and I was gathered together and put back as the individual that I had always known as my own consciousness. And at that point in time, I was called to account for the deeds of my life. This is what's spoken of in the near-death literature as the life review. Rather than being a review, it was really more like a reliving of my life, but from a much greater point of consciousness, and the life of every other human being that I had ever affected in any way through any of my actions while I existed in this physical world. suddenly I became aware that nothing went unnoticed. Not a thought, not an intention, not a moment, not a tear shed, not a smile, not a blink. Nothing in our lives goes unnoticed, and that every moment of my life, as is true for all of us, I was being showered with this unconditional, this great and creative force, this tremendous power of God or of love. And suddenly, by that standard, when I relived my life, it was as if I had held a candle to the sun, and I instantly had a point of perspective. And suddenly I realized it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. I could never express enough of this loving force in this world through my choices. I could never have given enough. I couldn't have sacrificed my life for humankind every moment of my life, and that wouldn't have been enough in comparison to the extent of the love with which, and the mercy and the bounty and the glory with which every soul, by its very existence, is being showered at every instant, although we seem to be unaware. So from this perspective, I relived my life. And it was as if every action were a stone thrown into a pond of water. And those actions had effect on every living individual in one way or another, even though we couldn't, in this physical life, truly perceive that. And so you can imagine every action that was loving, that I relived through my own choice, and then through the effect that it had on the people that I interacted with, and then through the people that they then interacted with, and so on and so on and so on, seen throughout all physical reality. Every choice and every action that was loving became incredibly glorious. That was loving in a selfless sense, and in an unconditional sense. And every action that was selfish became as nothing, really. It was as if I were dead at that moment. And every action that were motivated in any way that could be considered or construed as being cruel, or with a cruel thought even, became incredibly hurtful. And I relived this not just as myself, but again as every person that it had ever impacted, but from a greater point of consciousness than either I or they had in this physical life. I became aware that the greatest of my actions was not having owned anything, or having known anyone, or having been given any titles or names, or having achieved anything in this physical world of existence that was necessarily recognized by humankind, such as becoming successful in one way or another. This was not important in judging my life. But the greatest of all of my actions were those that were motivated by selfless love. And the greatest of all of those was, as a teenager, I had worked with retarded children every summer. And I had taken aside a young boy who was particularly difficult and particularly obnoxious and abrasive and usually rejected by the people in the camp and the children and the counselors and whatnot. And I had taken him aside one hot summer day and sat him on a wall and gave him some punch and saying to him, and I simply wanted to express to him that he was precious, that he was unique, that he was lovable by his very existence. I wanted really to express a sense of selfless love to this child who seemed to be abandoned and rejected and viewed as worthless to all. This was an action that no one recognized. It was an action that I didn't even remember until the near-death experience. But this was to have committed such an action, to have shown love to another individual, regardless of their deservingness or their station or the recognition of anyone in this world, to show for selfless love, just an instant of selfless love in our lives. To have done that, to have achieved that, was greater than to have, if I had become President of the United States or won the Nobel Peace Prize. That mere instant of showing forth love was greater than anything that we recognize as being accomplishments in this material world, in the way of our social structures. And what was important was not merely the action, but the intent and the motivation of the action. This is what distinguished great from meaningless actions and moments. And again, the only proper motivation was the motivation of selfless and altruistic and unconditional love.
So her talk carries on for about another hour, and truly incredible story. But what I got from that in particular was that message of love, altruistic love, a love which is not done for any particular, an action which is not done for any particular purpose except to express love, is the judgment, is the bar, is what we need to try and do. The next talk is a segment of a much larger talk given by Dr. Eben Alexander, and this, many of you may well recognize this coming video. It was given to the Theosophical Society of America at Wheaton, Illinois, back in 2015. Dr. Alexander was introduced by Tim Boyd, and in the audience I recognized Ed Abdel and Vic Houchin and Betty Bland, I believe. So we pick up the story soon after the beginning. It's about an hour and a half in total. We've got about another 20 minutes. So Eben Alexander is an academic neurosurgeon. It worked in various hospitals, including Massachusetts General, lectured at Harvard Medical School. And like many in the medical profession, perhaps he was very much a scientist and a materialist. However, in 2008, he developed a meningitis, so inflammation and infection around the brain, a particularly nasty form of meningitis called an E. coli or gram-negative meningitis, rare and very severe. So he has his near-death experience in that context of his severe meningitis. Thanks, John.
Last forever. And what happened next was this slowly spinning white light that came towards me, a very clear and pure light that had fine white and gold tendrils off of it. And this white light came towards me, and the best part about it is it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And it turns out that I had been aware of sound in that earthworm eye view, that very primitive existence. The sound was a pounding, monotonous sound, like someone smashing on an anvil over and over again. Just a steady rhythm. And it was a very cursing sound. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody, absolutely beautiful. And as you will hear, sound, music, vibration, frequency is the way that our souls transcend in these levels. It's one of the reasons why sound, hymns, chants have been used for thousands of years to help engender deep transcendental conscious states in any kind of spiritual broadening of consciousness, religious ceremony, etc. And that sound is absolutely essential to the work I do now. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but that melody, spinning melody as I called it, came towards me, and it opened up like a rip in that ugly earthworm eye view, and it was a rip that opened up into this brilliant, ultra-real valley. And I remember ascending up into this valley, up into this brilliant greenery, lush with life, absolutely fertile. And I had no body awareness, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck on a butterfly wing. Now, this was not a butterfly like some entomologist here on Earth can give you genus and species. This was the real deal. And butterflies in that realm, just like we often have dragonflies, butterflies, and hummingbirds that are messengers from that realm, from souls of the departed loved ones. And there are thousands of stories out there. I'm sure there's some in this room about that very phenomenon. But in that realm, butterflies are far more powerful and amazing than they are in this realm. And I was a speck of awareness, and it turns out on this wing of this butterfly, this was one of millions of butterflies, and they were looping and swirling in this beautiful river of love and color and life beyond description. And I remember how we would dip down and go through that lush greenery, and there would be flowers and blossoms, buds on trees that would open up even as we flew by. I remember the rich textures and colors beyond the rainbow, and so beautiful. And in that beautiful valley, as we would come up and ascend above all that greenery, I could see that there were hundreds of souls dancing. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, as I came back to this world and was trying to record the whole experience, I described them as being dressed in peasant garb, very simple clothing, yet beautiful colors, and tremendous joy and merriment. And there were lots of children playing and dogs jumping, and it was just a wonderful festival. And it was all being fueled because up above, in the velvety black skies above, were pure spiritual beings, orbs of golden light, swooping and swirling in formation, leaving sparkling golden trails, emanating these hymns, chants, anthems, powerful like a tsunami wave, crescendo after crescendo after crescendo of the most beautiful music, waves washing through me. And that's what was fueling this incredible joy and mirth going on in this Gateway Valley, as I came to call it. Now, the important thing to understand is that that Gateway Valley was much more real than this world. Far sharper, crisper, and more real than this. This is very dreamlike by comparison. That was a deep, deep mystery to me for a long time, trying to understand that ultra reality. It's very hard to put it into words. And when I would first describe that to people and talk about the ultra reality, people would say, well, is that like high-def TV? Well, it's a lot more than that. The way we know things there, you don't see with the eyes, you don't hear with the ears, you become others to feel the emotional power of existence. In fact, often if you get into the near-death experience literature, you read a lot about the tens of thousands of life reviews that people describe. You know that old saying, your life flashes before your eyes? Well, it's very true, and that's what near-death experiencers tell you, is that you go through every bit of your life, all the crucial parts that are there to teach you about the lessons of good and bad that are still residual lessons for you to learn, to help you and your higher soul and your soulmates, your soul group. And the judgment is not by any higher power, it's by our higher soul. That's what's doing the judging in that realm. And that's when we go through those life reviews, it's not some vague sepia-tinted memory. These are sharp, clear, crisp, absolute reliving the events more powerfully than when we live through them in the earthly realm. And we have to feel the power of our decisions, the emotional impact on our fellow beings. So if we lived a life handing out pain and suffering to others, we have to feel that in that life review. But we have to feel it far more sharply than they felt it here in the material realm, which is a pale, dim reflection of that far more real and crisp world of that gateway realm, of the realm between lives, where we reunite with our higher souls and where we reunite with our soul mates. And in the glaring, beautiful, all-loving light of that infinitely powerful God, that is the setting in which we relive those events and then plan our next incarnations for coming back in. But it is a very crisp ultra-reality. This is all about those lessons that we're here to learn. And the coin of that realm is love, that unconditional love that goes far beyond the phrase, far beyond those words. And of course, so many who have had near-death experiences and shared death experiences and other similarly spiritually transformative experiences know exactly what that's all about, that unconditional love. And the reason it's so important for all of us to get is because we're here in Soul School to learn those lessons of that love. And what we find is that that unconditional love has infinite power to heal. And I came from my journey to see that the hardships and difficulties in this life, and I promise you as a neurosurgeon, as a doctor, that very much includes illness and injury. They are gifts. They are opportunity for growth of our souls. We are all here as members of soul groups to do this growing. And when I talk about soul mates, I'm not just talking about that love of your life. I also came to see that often those who I had seen before my coma as my nemesis, as someone who was in my way, preventing me from getting something I wanted in this life, often is a very near and dear soul mate. And I came to see the power of that love, that unconditional love, to heal. It heals the individual, it heals the soul group, it heals all of humanity, it heals life all around this world, and it heals consciousness throughout this universe, because there are many sentient beings in many civilizations throughout all of eternity, throughout this universe. This is a much bigger party than I might have ever thought before. And this is all part of our joining that much bigger awareness and knowing of consciousness in its grandest sense. Now, it turns out that in that beautiful Gateway Valley, that ultra-real valley on that beautiful butterfly wing, the best part about it, I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful girl, and I promise you it doesn't get better than that. And it turns out, I'll never forget the way she was sitting, the way she was dressed, the way she looked at me. And she looked at me with this very loving smile that transcends any of our words of love and our uses of romantic love or the love of parent and child, any of the kind of love that we have here, love for all of humanity. This is the love that transcends it all, is that unconditional love that we encounter there. People who have near-death experiences, even if all they do is touch briefly, glimpse that unconditional love, it changes their life forever. So don't let the simplicity of that phrase lead you astray. It is infinitely powerful. It's something that we all know because all of our souls have been there before and go back, and we cycle through again and again in our ascent. Now, another thing that's very important to understand is that time flow in that gateway realm is very different from time flow here. That's one of the reasons why those life reviews, the memories are not just vague memories, but very strong, powerful learning opportunities where the goods and bads of our life and what we've done to others, feeling the impact of our decisions on others, is so hyper real. And we go through it, like they say, flashes before your eyes. And the amazing thing is it doesn't take anything of Earth time. It could happen in a second, or it could take a century to unfold. It doesn't matter. Because time flow and causality in that realm is a much higher order than in this realm. And that's why often when I talk about reincarnation, some people get a little worried and say, well, wait a minute, what if the love of my life gets tired of waiting for me and they reincarnate before I get there? I promise you that doesn't happen. because this is really all about love, and it's all about the relationships that we have. This is all about learning in soul school and growing as we do. And there's nothing more complex than knowing that it's simply by following a pathway that is one of manifesting that love as best we can. Love is the coin of that realm. And the more we can serve as conduits of that love, because our very consciousness is a direct, absolute connection to the divine, infinite healing power of that all-loving source. And by serving as conduits for that and allowing the love to come through us to our fellow beings, to show compassion, forgiveness, mercy, acceptance, that's all that matters. And that's what these lessons are all about. And that's how our souls ascend, is by getting closer and closer to that perfection of that love and ascending towards that oneness with the divine. Now, it turns out that this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, as I said, she never said a word. She didn't have to. Her thoughts came straight into my awareness. Now, of course, I had no words or language, so it was pure conceptual flow. But when I wrote it all up a few weeks later, when I came back to this world, I put those thoughts down that had come to me directly from her with that all-loving smile. And this is, in my view, the central message of Proof of Heaven. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of. And nothing to fear is very, very critical, because I saw very much, in my view, how this was not a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. In fact, there's plenty of evil and darkness in this world, but it's not a force that is against love and light of that infinitely powerful Creator. We simply serve as channels to bring that love and light into this world, and it displaces the darkness and evil. The darkness and evil are plenty real in this material realm, and you can also encounter them in those lower spiritual realms, such as I did in that earthworm eye view. The important thing to remember is when you know and fully know that you are a divine, eternal, spiritual being directly connected to that all-powerful creative deity, you have nothing to fear. And that is all you need to know. When you believe that and know that, it enables you to bring that lightness and love into this world in the face of darkness and evil as we perceive it here, and to do so in those spiritual realms and ascend higher and higher towards that oneness with the divine.
It's a shame we have to stop it there, because he goes on, and I don't want to give well, I will give the game away. That girl he saw sitting on the wing ended up having a closer relationship to him who he was than ever he could have thought. He was, Eben Alexander was adopted, and he only met his biological parents many years after this experience, after he'd written his book. And he finally was able to, they'd agreed to meet him. So he went round to their house, and there on the wall was a photo of their daughter who had died many years beforehand, and who obviously Eben Alexander had never been able to meet. And the face of that daughter was the woman on the butterfly wing. So quite an incredible reinforcement to him of the reality and truth of the experience he had. The last clip I have chosen is from a man who actually hasn't had a near-death experience, but in his career has come to believe in the reality of life after death and life between lives. And as a hypnotherapist, he was able to develop a technique which let people access that realm. And was his book, which I had originally read, which really put me on a broadened path through life to explore the spiritual realm. So this is Michael Newton, Dr. Michael Newton. It's quite a few years old now, this recording. He has since passed, but his institute is still carrying on his work.
Traditional therapist. Initially, I worked not in past life regression or in any of the things that I do today. Primarily, I was working in behavior modification and working with people who had problems with sleeping and with depression, this sort of thing. In time, people would come to me and ask, well, since you are working in hypnosis, is it possible that you could take me into a past life? And I was very imperious in those days. I said, no, I don't do those kinds of things. I'm terribly sorry, but I'm very traditional in my academic orientation, and you would have to go to somebody else for that kind of thing. So what happened to me was that after a number of years passed, I had a client who came complaining of a pain in his side. He told me that he'd been to many medical doctors, had x-rays, and was told that it was all psychosomatic. It was in his mind, and that if he just forgot about it, it would go away. But it was causing him intense pain. He wasn't sleeping well, and so forth. He asked me if I could possibly find any root causes for this in his childhood, if I could regress him to his childhood. So I did this, and we searched, and I looked through many of the early aspects of his childhood, and I could find him not falling on a sharp object or being involved with knives in any way or anything that would cause this very sharp pain in his side. So finally, in frustration, I said to this individual, who, by the way, went very deep very quickly in hypnosis, which is an important part of what I'm saying, because that, to me, is a key in reaching into the past life work that I now do and my interlife work. I said, go to the source of your pain. Tell me the first time it happened. And suddenly he was on the battlefields of France in World War I, in a British division at the Battle of the Somme, and was being bayoneted. So while the poor fellow had suddenly regressed into a past life, almost getting ahead of me, and he's lying in the mud dying, I'm so skeptical, because that's my nature, that I'm asking him to describe his division patch for me on his arm. What battle is this, I asked. Where are we? Who are you fighting? Because I'm not satisfied that this is really happening to me. So he described all these things very accurately, and since I am an amateur historian, I knew he was accurate. And so I realized that I'd had my first past life case, and I worked in desensitizing him, just as I would have done if he'd have been a 6-year-old child who'd speared himself in the kitchen, for instance, while his mother wasn't there. So from that case, I realized that that past life regression was very real. I was still somewhat skeptical. I did a lot more experimenting, of course, and working with people, and a lot more time passed. And then what happened to me was another case, almost by accident. A lady came to me who complained of loneliness and isolation in society, and she felt that she was not really a part of this world, that she just felt so disoriented with the life that she was living and the people that were around her. She was thinking of suicide. And so, again, I worked with this lady as I had done with this man, but not in past life work. We talked about a lot of childhood issues. I put her in hypnosis. We worked a lot with her early life and so forth, and really didn't come up with anything. So, like with the man I just spoke about, I asked this lady, go to the source of your loneliness and lack of companionship. And again, she was very somnambulistic. She went very deep very quickly. She was a very good hypnosis subject. And she said, I see them all right now, my companions, they're here in front of me. And I thought, you know, what are we talking about here? Is this a bridge group? Who are these people? And she's staring at my office wall with a glazed look, and she sort of, her eyes are fluttering. And she's saying to me, no, these are my spiritual soulmates. And there are 8 of them, and she described who they are. And I couldn't believe this. There just chills went up and down my spine, that I had actually, I was talking to someone who was talking about a life between lives. And this is an area of which I had no experience and I'd read no books on. There weren't many books even touching on the subject. So from that case, I began to really research the area between lives. And I soon, as time went on, I changed it to working basically with people who want to know about their immortality. People who now come to me who are interested in finding out who they really are, who their soulmates are, what their spirit group is like, why they are here on earth, and so forth. To me, these are the profound questions in life. At the moment of death, you rise above your body and you look back at it. Now, there have been a lot of near-death experience reports. There have been books written about near-death experiences, and certainly people who have gone through this have appeared on television and radio and have described to the public in many forums how they felt and what they experienced. But you have to keep in mind that in a near-death experience, we're talking about someone who is clinically dead only for a few minutes, so they wouldn't be around to tell what they experienced. In my case, I have a client in hypnosis for some 3 hours, questioning him about these things. They're also in a relaxed state. They're not undergoing any body trauma. So they're able to tell me in a very clear and forthright way everything that happened to them. Now, let me explain that there are two types of souls. There are the more advanced type and there are the beginner type souls. There are really a few more types, but I'll just talk about these essentially. The beginner soul, that is the person who has not lived all that many lives, sometimes has difficulty separating from their body. And not that they're not released at the moment of death, but they hang around. They want to go to their funerals, and we're so vain. You know, these people will describe how they want to find out who's coming to their funeral, who's bringing flowers, how much respect is their body being shown, you know, being cremated or being put into the ground or what have you. So you have that type of soul who's not really ready to leave Earth's astral plane immediately because they're a little disoriented, and also they're kind of reluctant to leave this life in which they've, you know, had so much enjoyment. Then you have the second major type, which are those souls who've been around a long time and they're very experienced. They usually leave very quickly. And so both types, when they look back at their bodies, I want to tell you that there is something that's uppermost on their mind, and that is to comfort the loved ones that are left behind. All souls will try to reach out and comfort those who are mourning their deaths. They will try to reach into their minds and soothe them in various ways and give them through thought, powerful thought messages, the understanding that they're still alive. Sometimes it's hard because, of course, when we're undergoing this kind of grief, you can imagine that we're so overcome with grief that we might shut down in terms of these messages. So these souls might not be able to reach their loved ones for perhaps days or weeks or months later. But that is the intent, to make them feel comfortable. Then, as they pull away, souls describe bright lights and tunnels, the same as the folks that tell us who have had near-death experiences that they have seen. Now, let me explain something I think is really important. We've heard a lot about people seeing religious figures who have undergone near-death experience. I find no case in all of the cases that I've had over all of the years that I've been working with people through their death experiences who have ever seen a religious figure. What they see are their spiritual guides. These are those loving beings who are their teachers, who come to them at the moment of death to guide them into the spirit world. Now, I'd like to also say that you may also see people who you have known in this life who have passed on ahead of you, who will also come and welcome you back. And this, too, is a very wonderful experience. For instance, people will see their mothers, for example, or a best friend who may have died in front of them, or a brother or sister, this sort of thing. And it's a very ennobling and beautiful experience for them. Let me describe to you where I think some people get an idea of a tribunal. And this might be filtering down through their subconscious mind. We do go before a council of what I call elders, wise beings. They've been called the old ones, the sacred ones. There's lots of different names. These are very advanced beings who review the life just lived. Our guides do this. Our guides do this when we first cross over. They talk to us in the privacy of a very quiet setting. And so we can kind of unwind and get re-energized. And then we usually go into our home, if you will, our place in the spirit world where we belong. And we can talk about that in a few minutes. But what I'd like to tell you now is the tribunals concept that I hear a lot about. People worried that they might be hauled in front of demonic judges and made to account for all their sins. These wise beings are more advanced teachers. They rank, if you will, even above our guides in terms of knowledge, understanding, and experience. What generally I find happens is that our guides accompany us to a very quiet, serene area where these beings will talk to us. Now, I'd like to point out that I have had clients who have had only 3 of these elders in front of them, and some as many as 10 or 12. Really depends on the individual, what spirit group they're located in terms of how advanced they are and so forth. These beings will question them in a very gentle way about how you, as the person who has just died, conducted your last life, and how you feel about how well you did, or where you had failings and where there were shortcomings, and they would also like to talk to you about your successes. So it's a very gentle process, and it's one that everyone experiences between lives after every life. And sometimes people will go before them again before their next life in order to review the life to come. But essentially what they are very wise, understanding beings who will really review with us where we made our mistakes and how we can do better in our next life. Essentially, in the beginning of our many, many existences, it's about learning lessons. It's about improving, understanding where we are in terms of our development and where we need to go. And the reason that that's such an important question is that many, many people that I work with incarnate on other worlds and are in other dimensions besides Earth. Earth has a particular difficulty in that we have amnesia. Our human minds set up an amnesic block when we come into this world so that we, in fact, don't have any knowledge that we can recall readily about the spirit world or our spirit guides. Interestingly enough, it's not so true with young children. You see a little boy or girl playing in a sandbox, 1 year old, 2 years old, and they're having these imaginary playmates, which may not be so imaginary. But by the time they're in the 1st grade in school, we've pretty much knocked all that out of them. And so, you know, that amnesic block is pretty much set. And so they don't remember themselves as spirits, and they don't remember their friends in the spirit world as spirits. But what's interesting is that it is a planet, Earth is, of self-discovery. The idea is that by not knowing the answers to the test questions before you come in, you solve these problems yourself in your own way, in your own time, and in your own environment, and in your own body. Not to say that we don't have genetic problems. There are those who select bodies who do have problems with aggressive behavior. Maybe they have a chemical imbalance that causes other behavioral problems that they need to overcome in order to achieve the lessons for which they came through to accomplish on Earth. And I'd like to point out that it's by design. Everyone in every body has selected that body. They knew in advance what the body was going to be like to a certain extent, and they chose that body with the help of their guides in order to achieve certain lessons. But these same folks can also incarnate on other planets where there is no amnesia. They can be flying creatures. They could be undersea creatures who are very intelligent. They could be interdimensional shadows. They can be flames. They can be water or gas-like creatures. There are all different ways in which we can progress and learn and understand about who we really are and the power of our energy. Earth is only one school. For me, it's difficult to say the word God because, to be quite frank with you, I came into this as an atheist. I did not believe in God. I did not believe that there was anything after life but ultimate oblivion. And my clients kind of brought me to this kicking and screaming, brought me to the party. And it was only after years of work with them and the consistency of the reports and knowing what I do about hypnosis and doing the work and research myself that has finally brought me to the point today where I can say that I believe in a power greater than myself, a source for all life and all intelligence. So the concept of all this incarnation is to arrive at that state of perfection where we can rejoin, if you will, that source from whence we came. This is one of the most jovial parts, if I could call it that, of my work. Some people think that I spend a little too much time with this and make too light of it. I believe that it's important that everybody know that the spirit world is a place of humor and fun. It is not all business. It is not all the kinds of things I describe in some of my chapters about energy work, creation work, learning to cope with our lessons in classroom type situations. There's a lot of that. But we also have R&R, rest and recreation. And I've had many clients tell me about playing games. Some of the games I hear are like Red Rover, where sides will line up opposite each other and come crashing together as balls of energy in order to unite and blend their intelligent energy. And it's kind of like playing bumper cars. Others will talk about a dodgeball game where they will throw bolts of energy at each other, or playing tag, these kinds of things. And there's a lot more esoteric type games where they can go to other worlds where there is no human life, for example, and frolic, if you will, on that world as spirits who are not there to learn lessons, but to simply have fun with each other. And they play. So once in a while, when I give a speech about the fact that there is a lot of humor and play in the spirit world, some people get a little upset because they think it all should be very, very serious. And I find that that's just not true. What is interesting about talking to people who have incarnated on other worlds is that there is a similarity here. Now, it may be that those people who come to Earth also like to go to certain other worlds because what it is that appeals to them about Earth may also be appealing in terms of another kind of environment that's rather similar. Traditional therapist. Initially, I worked not in past life regression or in any of the things that I do today. Primarily, I was working in behavior modification and working with people who had problems with sleeping and with depression, this sort of thing. In time, people would come to me and ask.
Okay, so yeah, it was just restarting then. So essentially, the message from all three of the speakers is that we incarnate, and it's all about love. It's all about developing love and becoming more loving. But this message has always been there. It's been there in various religions and philosophies, and I've just got a few quotes from various religious systems and philosophies. We've got some from the Baha'i faith, and we've also got some here from Helena Blavatsky, from our own writings in the Theosophical Society. And I'd like to end with this last one by Gottfried de Perucker, another theosophist. Love is the cement of the universe. It holds all things in place and in eternal keeping. Its very nature is celestial peace. Its very characteristic is cosmic harmony, permeating all things, boundless, deathless, infinite, eternal. It is everywhere and is the very heart of all that is. So the message of the NDE, in my opinion, and of all spiritual life and growth is about developing love and getting better and better and doing that. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Alastair. I have to say, what a most helpful presentation, and thank you for all the clips. They really hone in, I think, on what questions they have around some of this. They were all very practical, helpful, informative. So I definitely think also the message of love being the emphasis throughout your whole talk. That message was so clear. So I actually think it's a very beautiful message to bring through, because that jumps in with the theosophical traditions and other traditions as well. That, you know, love is kind of the glue, isn't it, that holds us all together. So thank you, Alastair. While people, if you have any questions, please send them through. I just have a question for Alastair here. As you are a doctor and you're dealing with death quite regularly, because I know when we spoke earlier, one of your patients died last week. You met them on the Monday, and then on the Friday, they died. So having studied the NDE, has this affected and changed how you perceive death, how you talk to your patients and see life? Could you sort of expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. I mean, I don't get the privilege of being so much in for the pastoral care for the patients. I'm involved more with the diagnosis, but you know, I do look in their eyes and I see the fear, and whether I ask, you know, what have you found? Often by this stage they already have an inkling. I just try and be as compassionate and kind and loving and honest as I can.
Oh, that's lovely.
Towards those people.
Yeah.
No, you know, and from what I know personally and my work with TS is that there is a purpose and a love behind everything, no matter what. And cancer cannot destroy the soul. Cancer cannot do that. The soul and love conquers all.